All right, Andrew, now you can relax.
That's right.
This is the fun part. I finally got Andrew Smith in here into my podcast. And it was. I will give you an award, actually. You were the hardest one to get in. I must have asked you a half a dozen times, and you're like, well, maybe one day. And so today's the day.
The day, that's right.
Yeah.
I'm very excited about it. First, I had to figure out what a podcast was. It was,
and did you figure it out?
I did very quickly. Next person I talked to after you said, well, this is what it is. It's like listening to the radio. But
that's it. It's just a long format discussion.
Long format, yeah.
And so one of the things, I mean, I've known you probably, 30 years, you think? 25 for sure.
Certainly, yeah.
I was always in awe of you, actually, in a lot of ways, because I always felt like you, were a very good businessman, which I really liked. And a lot of people in the art world aren't. And two, you're the leader, one of the top leaders in your field in photography, and I love photography. And so where'd you grow up, Andrew?
I grew up in Santa Fe, actually.
You did?
Santa Fe, New Mexico.
See, I learned something I didn't know.
My father was a radiologist. So I grew up looking at big negatives, is what I say. You know, I couldn't read them very well. He would read all the gray tones and tell me what was going on. But it was photographically related.
And do you remember those early times with your father looking at, would he bring you into the hospital?
Every day after school, we'd go hang out at his office, waiting for them to finish work. And so me or my brothers or sister would be there, sitting there while he would do his procedures and things. And he'd do his dictation, and we'd sit there and look at the big x-rays, or we'd sit in the waiting room, or at some point we might even develop x-rays, though by the time I was old enough to develop x-rays, they had machines that would do it, which I think I'm happy about, because I never have really liked the smell of photographic chemistry that much.
And would you sit with your dad, and he would go, okay, this is what we're looking at, and this is this and that?
Yeah. He would go over, he would say, this is the gallbladder, and this is, things going on in the GI tract, or the procedures that we do, the broken legs and stuff. He had a very active practice. So he was stationed there in World War II. In Santa Fe, there was a hospital called Bruns Army Hospital. And after the war, then he went to, his main focus then after that was he was with the Army of Liberation. He was the first doctor, with the first group of doctors that liberated Dachau in 1945. And he went there without any supplies. His job was to assess, with a couple other people, was to assess what they needed. And that became the defining moment of his life. But he was also a medical doctor, a radiologist. My mother was a pediatrician. And so he grew up in New York City, and they had a very strong arts background. My father would have liked to have been a singer and had gotten accepted into Juilliard to study voice, but chose medicine instead. His father had been a doctor in the Lower East Side of New York.
So he got the pressure from his dad to go into medicine and give this singing stuff up?
Yeah, but his sister, on the other hand, had run away at the age of 17 and gone to Europe, where she studied with Paderewski, studied the piano. So there was that part of culture and that part of music and visual arts that he grew up with and was around him growing up. And he valued it, and my mother valued that kind of cultural ideas. And so moving to Santa Fe after the war, they moved to Santa Fe and got involved in the community. And Santa Fe is a very artistic community.
And when would he have moved to Santa Fe? Right after the war?
They moved. 46? He had to finish his residency still, even though he practiced during the war. So he moved to Minneapolis to finish that, and then he ended up in Santa Fe.
And would he talk about liberating in Dachau? I mean, did he spend time with you ever talking about that?
He didn't. He thought about it. He had what we would call PTSD.
I would assume.
In today's world. And he didn't really start talking about it till the late 1960s, when he decided that he would write about it. But while he was at Dachau, he made photographs. Wow. He wrote my mother letters every day about what he was a witness to the horrors of the Holocaust.
Wow.
And wrote about that. And so, but he practiced, he had a great sense of humor, he had other interests, but this was always a little bit underneath that. And then at the same time, my mother was a very active pediatrician in Santa Fe. She was one of the few doctors in the early 1950s that would treat polio patients. So
She were
herself,
afraid that they would get polio.
and she actually did get polio. When she was pregnant with me in 1951, she contracted polio. So she was sent to Chicago, where I was born, and then they sent me back. And she recovered from the polio and practiced out of a wheelchair for 35 years.
My dad had that as well. He had polio as well.
And then I had 2 brothers and a sister, and so we would go to concerts and we would go to the art shows in Santa Fe. There were artists who were kind of all around. Either my father would see them in professional circumstances. There was only one hospital in Santa Fe, so anybody who got sick was there. If you were needed an X-ray in Santa Fe, and something happened, then you would go to my father.
Was he like the one radiologist?
His practice. He had a practice, a 3-person practice, and they covered all of northern New Mexico: Las Vegas, Taos, Los Alamos, and Santa Fe. And so, one of his most famous patients was Greta Garbo, who was in Santa Fe for some reason and had needed some procedure. So my father and his partners did that. So there was that.
For those who don't know who Greta Garbo is out there, she was a famous movie star at the time in the 40s and 30s.
And so they had a rural practice. It was a small town in some ways, 30,000 people, but my mother was one of 4 pediatricians. So you could say that she kind of knew 1/4 of the population of Santa Fe, just in passing, because that was kind of the division of labor among the pediatricians in Santa Fe. So we grew up looking at art. There were some great artists living there. Laura Gilpin was living there. George O'Keeffe was nearby. Our next door neighbor was a man named Maurice Loriot, who designed church interiors in stained glass. And was quite well known around the world at that time for being one of the great stained glass church interior designers and architects. And so then I went to public school in Santa Fe, which at the time was pretty good. It was about the time, in my opinion, when schools started to decline, public schools, and the pressure. Santa Fe at the time had 1 public high school and 1 Catholic high school.
Was that Santa Fe High?
Santa Fe High.
Yeah.
And then the prep school, the private school started, and it drew off all the good teachers from the public schools. And that started the decline in many ways of the public school system.
And you graduated Santa Fe High?
I graduated there and went to college.
How many Anglos were there at that? What was the population?
Well, let's say in my graduating class, there were 700 people,
yes.
and I was the only Smith.
Yeah, I understand. I mean, I grew up in New Mexico and graduated too. So
there was a kind of there was a cultural matter of factness about dealing with the native populations, the Hispano population and the Indian population. It wasn't that we kind of just respected each other. We dealt with each other. There was some separation as growing up later. I realized there was some separation of the communities.
Well, and you're growing up during the civil rights time, just like I was to some extent. You graduated high school, what, 68?
69.
69. Yeah.
And so one of the things that they had in high school one of the courses I took was a course in anthropology. And we went out to Chaco Canyon.
Wow, for high school?
For high school, and a high school trip. And that, in many ways, changed my life because it was such a staggering, wonderful place to go see history and prehistoric, pre-Hispanic history. And so I went to Colorado College, and there I ended up studying anthropology and studied ethnohistory, which is kind of modern-day history of things that are current, a lot of it having to do with oral history and oral traditions. And at Colorado College, when I was there, they also changed from a semester system to a block system. And a block system is where you take one course for 3.5 weeks intensively. And so that's the system it's set up with. And it's a way of research that still follows me into my projects 45, 50 years later.
In what respect?
when we get a collection, it takes a few weeks of intensive research to figure out what it is we have, who it is, learning about the history of the person, the project, where they photographed. One of my favorite examples that we had a few years ago was an Italian photographer named Vittorio Sella. And Sella was the greatest high-altitude mountaineering photographer in the history of photography. He was from the Bahia area in the Piedmont region of Spain.
Mm-hmm.
And this was he was born in the late 1850s, and his uncle founded the Italian Mountaineering Club. His father wrote the first treatise on photography in Italy. The family had textile factories going back to the 1500s, so these were very well-to-do people, and they were friends with the king of Italy at the time. So when I first started doing my research on this, hadn't realized. I thought, who's the king of Italy? I'd never heard of the king of Italy, and so looking through Sella, we find out that his uncle helped unify Italy, and was instrumental in bringing Rome into the unification of Italy from the various city-states in the 1880s, in the late 19th century. And Sella was a very talented businessman, but he was also a very talented photographer. And he started photography very young, and by 1870, he was photographing in the Alps. He was also one of the great skilled climbers. He was about 5'6", and in today's world, we would call him an elite athlete. He was the first person to do the winter ascent of the Matterhorn, and had many other. And so, like all mountaineers at the time, there was this era of exploration. And conquering things that had never been conquered physically in the world at the time. And Sella was part of this group of mountaineers. And so he made many first ascents.
And also took photos.
And also took photographs. And his photographs he took he did a lot of tours of the Alps, but he also went to the Caucasus. He went to the Himalayas, where with the Duke of the Abruzzi, who was the nephew of the King of Spain, they attempted to climb K2 in 1909. And Sella got to about 22,000 feet to photograph. The Duke of Abruzzi set the world record at the time at 24,600 feet. They weren't successful in climbing K2, but they did set the altitude record on a nearby mountain.
Now, how do you end up with a group of, so you get this group of photos, you go, I don't know what they are.
And this group came from, is still owned by the Appalachian Mountain Club. And the Appalachian Mountain Club is the first environmental organization in the United States, formed in Boston. And so at the time in Boston, the Appalachian Mountain Club was the center of not only climbing and outdoor activities, but it was also a center of cultural activities dealing with exploration around the West and around the world. So they would have exhibitions. They would invite speakers in. One of the founders of the Appalachian Mountain Club, Charles, I think, Gay, was friends of the Sella family. And so he arranged to start showing photographs. And in 1893, they brought over an exhibition of 350 alpine and Caucasus photographs, which they ended up purchasing. And then they circulated them. Their idea was to make sure everybody in the area would be able to see it, and they would circulate it at exhibitions that lasted about a week. And it went to clearly over 100 regional libraries, local libraries, around New England, and eventually actually made its way all the way out to Portland for the Mazimas Club in 1897, I believe, when Sella happened to be going to do an expedition up at Mount St. Elias, which is on the Yukon-Alaskan border. And when he stopped in Portland on the train ride across the country to get up to the Yukon, his exhibition was in Portland.
And so did the club come to you and go, I have all these photographs?
The club, because of my interest in Western American photography, landscape photography, mountaineering photography, even polar photography, has that distinct nature of the Western landscape. And over the years, we've kind of built up that part of our business of Western American landscape photography. So that would include people like Carlton Watkins, who's the great California photographer beginning in the 1850s going to Yosemite. Made the first mammoth plate photographs, and mammoth plates are these 16 by 20 inch wet collodion negatives that they would make out in the field, and then they would contact print from them. So,
and so when you get this group of collection, your job is just to find out, in this case, was to find out the history and understand what they have, not really so much to sell it, but to...
Well, no, my job is to sell it.
Yeah, okay.
So first I have to find out what it is.
You have to really understand,
and I have to understand
what I have, where they come from, the history.
The history, who the photographer is. Sella was a very great technical photographer.
Yes.
He had a studio assistant that he worked with and helped printing and did some of the printing for him under his supervision. And in the 1940s, Ansel Adams discovered Sella's work and wrote and understood that Sella in many ways operated on many of the same ideas that Adams did about creating emotion in a photograph, and that when you take a picture, what you're looking at is, and what you should be thinking about is both what it looks like on a piece of paper, because what you're really creating is a piece of paper from the scene in front of you, and then you're infusing that moment with the emotion that you feel at the time. To create the drama in the picture, and so Ansel wrote about Sella in the 1940s. He did an article in the Sierra Club Bulletin extolling Sella's work and approach to photography.
Did you know any about that before you got the Sella photograph?
We actually had, because one of the photographers that we've dealt with for 35 years is a man named Jody Forster, who lives up in Mesa, one of the great contemporary landscape photographers of the Southwest, who did an expedition to the Himalayas and also did an expedition to Antarctica. So when he went to the Himalayas, I believe in 1994, he was going to the Khumbu region, which is near the Karakoram. And so Jody started telling us at the time teaching us about Sella, and he said Sella was the greatest of the mountaineering photographers.
And that's before you've ever gotten any of these photos?
Well before. Yeah. And so that put Sella on my radar, and from then on we started looking for his work.
So one photographer influenced you a living photographer told you about it, and made the connection with Ansel Adams, and then you found the article about Ansel, and then when you ended up getting the photos by this Sarah, right?
Sella. Vittorio Sella.
You can tell I don't know who he is. Then that opens up Pandora's box for you. And now once you get all those, and you have this huge, amazing collection, does that lead to, okay, Andy's the Sella guy, and more people, when they have Sellas they want to sell, are going to come to you?
Well, in this case, they will, but in this case, this is one of the largest collections in the world. It contains about 600 prints.
Yeah, that's a lot.
So, our challenge here is to find the right client or the right institution for it. It runs because of its institutions, and we do a lot of business selling collections, archival collections, ethnographic collections, documentary collections to various museums and libraries around the country, and as well as to private collectors. And so this is one where, for a lot of people, there are different views of photography. And if you grew up out west like I did, I was in love with landscape photography. Pictures of people never interested me so much. Santa Fe was a small town.
And I want to get back to that, actually. The Santa Fe is a small town, because you graduate in '69, which is a critical time with the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
And so how did you navigate that? Were you didn't go in the military, I assume?
No, I didn't go in the military. I was a conscientious objector.
Yeah. Ted Trotter was too, actually.
And my Presbyterian minister.
Yes.
And then there was a Christian brother who had moved to Santa Fe at the time, named Brother Godfrey. And they were my two advisors, and so I did that. And then I put my name in the lottery in the year that my lottery number came up. I was 193 the year they pulled to 175.
Yeah. So
But Brother Godfrey turned out to be not a full-time priest. He went on to a career as one of the greatest filmmakers in America. His name is Godfrey Reggio. And he produced a number of films with Philip Glass doing the music on Quiet Konatsky in the 1990s that were celebrated for their kind of intellectual heft and visual heft. Movies with no words, but only images and music. So that was part of just what was going on in Santa Fe. People would come there for one reason, but they like Godfrey Reggio, but as a Christian brother, but then he becomes one of the great filmmakers. And so Santa Fe did have a variety of people like that.
And where did you go to college from Santa Fe?
To Colorado College.
It was Colorado College. And you graduated
from there? Yeah, graduated from there.
Did you know John Massapus at all? He was about that same time frame.
Not that I can recollect.
He lives in Santa Fe, actually.
And then I ended up going to law school in the late 1970s to the University of New Mexico.
Let's hear about this. How did you go from that to, you were in anthropology, right?
I was in anthropology, but I had started my business in college, actually.
And what was that?
Well, let's go back to the Dachau. And
yes, I'd like to. And I'd also like to know what your dad thought when you said, I'm going to be a conscientious objector.
He was all in favor of it.
Yeah.
He was
He'd
fully
seen the
supportive.
worst.
He had seen the worst, and he felt maybe that was the reason was part of that might have been coming down from him. So he started writing about Dachau in about 1969, and he had always been interested in books, and we'd spent one of our shopping when the Smith family would go out shopping on a Saturday afternoon. We'd end up at the Via Gra bookshop as one of the main stops in Santa Fe, or the New Mexico School Book Depository, which was another old bookstore in Santa Fe in the 1960s. And then at some point in 1969, a man named Jack Potter moved to Santa Fe. And Jack Potter had been a legendary antiquarian book dealer in Evanston and moved with his family there. His son Nicholas is one of my best friends and took over the business in 1975 when Jack died. So Jack became my mentor, and he became my father's mentor as well. So in the sense that he became my father's editor. My father at that time got very serious about writing about Dachau, and so Jack became his editor, and they became best friends. And at the same time, Jack had a variety of interests, and one of his main interests was he was also, besides being a great book dealer, and there are different kinds of book dealers. There are book dealers who are booksellers who know what they're selling, and there are book dealers who read all the books that they sell and know the contents of everything they sell. And Jack was one of the latter. He knew the contents of everything he sold. Brilliant man that way. He was a writer, poet, bibliographer of John Dos Passos, music connoisseur, loved the opera, but he would refuse to go to a live performance because he couldn't stand mistakes. But he was also a wine connoisseur. But in college, he started me out. So in college, to back up a little bit, in 1970, all the Edward S. Curtis photogravure material and copper plates for his famous project of the North American Indian migrated to Santa Fe. So there were 3 people who were responsible for bringing it to Santa Fe, and they were named David Padua, Jack Leffler, and Carl Kernberger. Carl was a photographer who was doing documentary work and had discovered Curtis through the Rosequist Gallery up in Taos. And at the time, what was Rosequist's name, the old man?
I don't remember.
But Rena and her husband were there. And so
Paul Rosequist?
And Rosequist had a gallery in Tucson.
Yeah,
also.
I think it was Paul Rosequist.
And they eventually got divorced, and Rena kept the one in Taos. And there was bad blood over how they found the Curtis and kind of took advantage of it. So Kernberger was one. Jake Leffler is one of the great ethnomusicologists. And characters and great intellectual characters. He's also a great environmentalist. Could have been a member of the Monkey Ranch gang. Was very good friends of Edward Abbey. Has done peyote with Carlos Castaneda, and is still alive in Santa Fe, doing fabulous oral history with people. And the third person was a man named David Padua, who was a New York lawyer, a Madison Avenue lawyer, who's, I understand at the time, legend had it that among his clients were Baba Ram Das. Alpert, who was Timothy Leary's LSD collaborator or something like that.
Yeah.
And so he ended up in Santa Fe. He had fallen in love with Curtis. All three of these people had fallen in love with Curtis independently.
And was this a collection that came out of Boston?
And so they then found the collection in Boston. So when Curtis's project started in 1904, and by the end of the project, and he published over a period of 24 years, 26 years, from 1904 to 1930. It was an enduring project. It was at its peak between 1906 and the onset of World War I. Curtis was the most famous photographer of his day, just as Ansel Adams was the most famous photographer of our day.
And was part of that because of him knowing Teddy Roosevelt and having J.P. Morgan give him money to support the project, do you think?
Absolutely. But he also created a publicity machine, and he publicized what he did with the money. He would go around the country giving lectures, sometimes with full orchestras giving lantern slideshows. And so there was a massive amount of lectures that followed it. And the legend of J.P. Morgan enhanced the stature of it. And the people, and so the project was to photograph the North American Indian before they vanished. It was the vanishing race trope. We can look at what that means now 150 years later, and we will look at that at some point as we got further into this podcast. Mm-hmm. And the trope really started in the 1810s. When the government started collecting paintings of Indians, because by that time there was the idea that the Indians were a race that was going to be eliminated, and so we should preserve their traditions. So there was a visual tradition of the government starting to collect paintings at that time. And in the 1850s, Ferdinand Hayden started talking about it, as did Joseph Henry. And Henry was the head of the Smithsonian at the time. And at the time, the Smithsonian was collecting paintings for the most part. In 1865, a fire burned down the Smithsonian and burned down all the paintings. But this discussion had been ongoing about what to do, and the additional person who was involved in the discussion was an English speculator and collector named William Henry Blackmore. Blackmore, who was from Salisbury, England, was involved in financial ventures all over the world, but was interested in ethnographic photographs around the world. And so in the 1850s, maybe early 1860s, the British had produced a book called something along the lines of the Census of India, in which they photographed various types of people from the country of India in this kind of ethnographic way that was done in the 19th century. It could have included phrenological measurements. There were straight-on and side views. So you could, and this was scientific inquiry.
So this is kind of the basis of what Curtis builds on from this tradition.
So the next person to build on this was Blackmore, working with Hayden and the Smithsonian. And Blackmore commissioned photographers to make pictures of Indians when they would come to Washington. Mm-hmm. He threw a party in Taos Pueblo, a photography party in 1871 at the Feast of San Jeronimo. Mm-hmm. And invited to photograph Indians who were coming in from around the area.
Were those people coming in for to trade?
To trade,
at the big trade. So he recognized you have a group of a variety of tribal natives coming in, and he saw an opportunity to try to capture these.
Yeah,
are these some of the earliest group
The
photos?
earliest groups, and so he commissioned people. The earliest groups of photographs of the American Indian were done in the late 1840s.
Right.
They were daguerreotypes.
The salt ones, right?
Daguerreotypes.
Oh, these were even
So
before.
these even before the
Yeah.
salt prints. So these were by commissioned a man named Zeno Schindler, who was a Washington, D.C. photographer, to rephotograph the daguerreotypes and earlier prints and make then contemporary prints for use.
And that's
So this is
18
1867.
Okay.
At the same time, he commissioned Alexander Gardner to photograph all the tribes coming into Washington, as well as Charles Bell in Washington. Gardner from primarily 67 to 74, and Bell Bell photographed the Indians primarily from 74 to the early 90s. Matthew Brady also had some of this business, as well as a couple of galleries in New York.
And these are the ones that would set all the delegations, the native delegations, against the backdrop of some Washington building
or in the studio.
Yeah.
And they would have either individual prints, and they would publish them. And then William Henry Jackson was the other main photographer who was involved, I would say. And he was the official photographer of the Hayden Survey.
Mm-hmm.
So it was
Which
the Hayden
went to
Survey
the-
who
which
published
went
the
to the Grand
photographs.
Canyon, right?
Yeah.
That-
No, they went to the Hayden Survey started out in Yellowstone and went through the Rockies, and then they did come down through the Grand Canyon.
Yes.
But it was the PAL Survey with Hillers that was the primary and primary group exploring the Grand Canyon. Though Lieutenant Wheeler also, the Wheeler Survey with Timothy O'Sullivan also did some work in the Grand Canyon, and that caused, and the rivalries between the groups. They were all looking for money from the same government pot, and so they would. Particularly when Wheeler did his work, everybody else was critical that the work had already been done by other photographers.
So when you're working with Potter as a mentor,
Right.
did you know any of this material, or is this the kind of thing that you learned through working with this book?
We didn't know any of this
Yeah.
information.
Because we kind of digressed, and you
Yeah.
were going to tell me how you got into your first
So anyway,
job.
so Potter, so Potter was a wine connoisseur and as well as a bookman. So I would go scout books for him. And book dealers at the time were in the 1960s and 70s, and even going into the 19th century, it turns out, were the source of most of the great photographs. Photographers and made photographic books, and they were distributed by photographers. Edward Muybridge, who was one of the great photographers, started out as a book distributor in San Francisco in the 1850s. So there was a part and parcel of that. At the same time, I was living in Santa Fe, and it was the beginning of, I think, the art business as we know it over the last 50 years.
What year would this been?
This was in 1972.
Okay, so that's very early. That was really when Santa Fe started to pop.
Yeah. So before that, Santa Fe had a number of prominent galleries. Jean Seth had a great gallery on Canyon Road. She was a friend of O'Keeffe's and would show O'Keeffe's work. There were some individual artists who had their own galleries. I think Margaret Jamison had started her business at that point in time. And that's about the time that...
The Fickery was there.
And then there was Vic Hansen.
Yeah, Vic Hansen
was one of the great antique guys and Hansen was Jerry Peters' mentor. And Peters had started his business when he was going to St. John's College in the 1960s and was working with Vic Hansen Vic Hansen knew about variety of material culture, particularly about painting and furniture.
And Hispanic as well.
And more important things. And not many people knew about photography. So you had a lot of great people who started their businesses and were just coming into the market over the early 1970s, ranging from Peters and Forrest Fenn to...
Potter, too, right? I mean,
to Potter, but you also had the Indian artifact business. Bob Ward was really getting going then. Rex Aerosmith had been around for a long time.
He opened his in like 50.
Yeah, and Rex had been there a long time. So Santa Fe was, and Taos was also a center, and we were all young. I when I finished college in '73, I was a liberal arts major. One of my favorite not direct quote, but it comes from a Walker Percy novel where he talks about being a liberal arts major and the ability to do everything but not really do anything.
Yeah.
And so I took that to heart. I had a job as I had majored in anthropology and done a project, a long-term research project on ethnohistory involving the founding of the San Antonio de las Huertas land grant, which is up in the Placitas, New Mexico area. Mm-hmm. And there was some folklore that was done about that in the 1930s as part of the WPA folklore project. So during that time in college, I started going to all the libraries in New Mexico, the state library, the state history library, the state library, which is different than the state history library.
To work on this one project?
To work on this one project.
And what turned you on about that project that you wanted to do it? That's kind of an obscure, esoteric thing for a kid who's probably 23 years old.
Well, I liked anthropology. I didn't like archaeology that much. And I didn't like I worked as a field archaeologist. There was a wonderful man who I worked for at the Laboratory of Anthropology named Stuart Peckham, who you could show a potsherd to from anywhere, and he could identify exactly what it was. Mm-hmm. I didn't have that kind of talent in that part of material culture, but eventually I discovered I had a visual sense. And I discovered that probably in 1973 or so, 1974, when I would scout for things. And there was
And did you start a real business at that time?
I did in 1974. I started my real business.
And what was the title? What was the name?
It's called just Andrew Smith. Books, photographs, and paintings. I think sole proprietorship. And so my first business transaction when I formally started the business was buying a bunch of Curtis prints from Jack Potter. So in the meantime, I had been scouting things, but I was able to find pretty interesting photographs, and I was usually unsuccessful at finding interesting items in books or paintings or artifacts or things like that. And so I started selling Curtis, and I had graduated from college, had worked some part-time jobs, had written the Great American Novel, which I sent to my writing teacher in college, who reminded me that I should probably find a different way to make a living, which I...
You still have that copy?
No, I threw it out. He was right, and it's something I appreciate very much, the sound advice he gave me at the time. And so I went to Madison, Wisconsin, where I was living, and I went to the Madison Art Center, and at the time, I had some small 6x8 inch Edward Curtis original photogravures from the North American Indian from this cache.
Right.
So we never went back to the cache that had come to Santa Fe. So let me backtrack on that. So in 1970, Loeffler and Kernberger and Padua purchased the inventory of the North American Indian. And
which included the plates as well?
The North American Indian was the company that Curtis started to publish his opus publication, and the publication had 20 volumes and 20 portfolios, contained over 2,200 illustrations and original photogravure prints, and is considered the most elegant illustrated book ever published. By the 1920s, Curtis was going bankrupt. Mm-hmm. In fact, he was going bankrupt before that, but
he went bankrupt every year.
But
they
had an obligation to finish the publication, because when it started in 1906, it was supposed to be 20 volumes covering almost all the areas where the North American Indian lived. And he would publish a book and a portfolio a year. He would do the field work in the summer and do the writing in the winter. The printers, he had a studio in Seattle and then in Los Angeles, but the printers for the photogravures were in Boston. And so when he went bankrupt, when he finished in 1930, and fulfilled all the subscriptions, the company went bankrupt. And one of the members who had been on the board of the earlier company was a man named J.W. Laureates, I think it was J.W., who had a bookstore in Boston, and he bought all the residue, which meant all the unsold and incomplete printings of the North American Indian, as well as all the copper plates.
Mm-hmm. What was his store called? Do you remember?
Laureates, Lauriates, and they were in Boston, famous antiquarian bookstore. And so by 1970, the guys in Santa Fe had discovered that the source of the material was coming from Boston. And so they went to Boston and they bought the warehouse. I think I once saw the original bill of sale, and it contained about 2,200 of or about 1,800 of the original copper plates, maybe a little bit more of the 2,200. Numerous sets, probably a few 100,000 prints, maybe 100,000 prints or something. The edition was an edition, was supposed to have been an edition of 500, but they did 300, so that means they made about 660,000 prints. And they had numerous sets. The volumes themselves, the smaller size, had 1,500 prints, and there were probably 30 sets of volumes in what they got, as well as portfolios, incomplete sets. In 1967, the Curtis laureates had commissioned a man named Deli Sagelato. No, they had actually commissioned a man named Emilio Caballero was someone else. Emilio Serini, to fill in some incomplete sets. They had sets where they had the first 11 and 12 portfolios and all the 20 volumes in the original paper, but they were missing the last 8 or 9 portfolios. So they commissioned Emiliano Serini to make the photogravures.
I.e. the Serini
The
prints.
Serini prints, which we call Serini prints. And that was an edition of supposedly 17. And he hired a man named Deli Sagelato to do the actual printing. And Sagelato later became the when the copper plates came to Santa Fe and were eventually sold over a number of years. Sagelato did a lot of the printing, but he also did printing for Robert Mapplethorpe and other people. He was considered one of the great gravure printmakers of the 1980s and 90s, 1970s, 80s, and 90s. Had a quite a steam studio in Florida that he worked out of. So at one point, so Jack Potter had an interest in wine. These guys had brought all the Curtis prints. They paid about a little over $50,000 for the group that they brought to Santa Fe. And so I would run wine for Potter. At the time, liquor laws were very restrictive, and Potter was a wine connoisseur. And the only place that he could get wine in the Rocky Mountain area was in Denver. And I was living in Colorado Springs quite a bit of the time. So there was in Boulder, there was a liquor store that would order wine for him. And so I would run cases of wine from Boulder to Santa Fe for $4 a case, as well as scouting books. And that was a lot of money at the time. And then I had bought these the Curtis plates, and I took them to Madison and stopped at the Madison Art Center.
Now these were the plates, not
These
the
were
prints.
these were prints, 3 small photogravures, and I sold 3 of them for $105.
Yeah.
And at the time, my rent was $80. That left me $25 for food and gas. It seemed like a pretty good way to make a living.
Right.
So then I moved quickly back to Colorado Springs. And at the time when I was in college, we'd also become one of the research facilities and areas that we worked with was the Colorado Springs Fine Arts Center. Taylor Museum. And so I started doing a circuit of visiting museums. At the time, the art business, Western art, artifacts was just starting, but the photography business also was just starting. So the first...
and was that photography for everything or really Western photography?
No, this is photography for everything.
Period.
So so if we look back at the history of photography galleries, in the 19th century, a lot of photographers would sell their own things at their own galleries.
Like Stiglitz.
Watkins had his own gallery where he would sell his views. William Henry Jackson, who was the great Colorado pioneer photographer, had one of the largest galleries in the country, and he would distribute not only his work, but he would buy work by a lot of other photographers, which he would publish under his name. And then in the 1880s, 1890s, there was starting to be discussions in the Great Britain, primarily about photography being art. There were lots of regional publications about photography that were very active starting in the 1850s. Photography was a very popular media. So if we go back and look at the 1850s, it wasn't uncommon, and it was a large there was a large economic impact it had. It was a major industry at the time. It was a part of science. People figured it was truthful. It replaced paintings. So there were daguerreotypists.
And it was new technology,
and it was
too.
new technology, but there were literally millions and millions and millions of daguerreotypes that were made in the 1850s every year on an annual basis. And so so you could make large collections. And so William Henry Jackson grew up in the New England, and in the Civil War was an illustrator. He moved out west after the Civil War, where he was among other things, he was a drover. But he also became interested in photography, and in 1867 moved to Omaha, where he purchased a studio with his brother and bought out some other studios. He became friends with Hayden during that time, Ferdinand Hayden. Mm-hmm. And in 1869, Jackson got married when other people were photographing the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. So a few months later, he went back and photographed along the route of the railroad. And his first sale, his first major sale at the time, was a sale of 10,000 prints, 100 prints, 100 copies of each, to the C.R. Anthony Company, and the Anthony Company was based in New York City. New York City had a half a dozen or a dozen view companies, and these were stereo views, small stereo views.
But for the real photography that we think of today, really didn't start until like the early 70s, when you kind of came on board as well, right?
And so, going back to the photography market, then Stieglitz started his gallery in the early 1900s, and he became the most prominent photography dealer. There were a number of initiatives that here and there a gallery would start. Ansel Adams, Stieglitz was the first great promoter of photography, and then Ansel Adams became the next great promoter of photography, starting in the 1930s. And then
Andrew Smith became the great
promoter,
but
with other people.
But that was in 1974?
70s, yeah, 72 to 74. So in the meantime, then the Museum of Modern Art had gotten a department of photography. People were interested. There was a woman named Helen G. in New York who set up a gallery called the Limelight Gallery in about 1959.
Yeah, because I know Dorothea Lange did her retrospective at
the Met.
Yeah, in 1965.
Yeah, and so then there were a couple pioneers in the 1960s. Carl Simbab in Boston set up maybe the first gallery in the late 1960s that started looking at people like Ansel Adams and Paul Caponegro and other people of a younger generation and promoting it and talking about it as art. The Witkin Gallery opened in New York. Lee Witkin, Tom Halstead opened a gallery in Chicago.
Did you know all these? Did you know some of these people?
I knew all of these people.
Yeah.
Or except Simbab, but we knew everybody else over time.
And when you opened your gallery in photography in the early 70s, were you the first guy to do that?
We didn't actually have a gallery. I dealt privately.
Well, were you the first private guy to dealing in that stuff there?
In New Mexico, I was.
Yeah.
But I had counterparts that were starting to come in the business, and there were starting to be, and there were also a couple of curators.
Like Terry Etherton
started a little later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, he looks at you as being a mentor, actually.
Yeah. So there were a couple of curators who were the most influential curators. One was John Zarkowski in New York, but the other was Van Daren Koch in Albuquerque. And Koch was a brilliant man and had a fabulous speaking voice and was a great writer as well as a great visionary about this, and was a photographer. He had worked with Edward Weston in the 1930s and 40s and become friends with him. He was friends with Beaumont Newhall, the great photo historian, and he built a department at the University of New Mexico in the 1970s that became the foremost department in studio photography as well as photographic history.
Is that still that way?
It lost some of its limelight. I think Yale is probably considered the strongest of the graduate schools at this point in time, but Princeton and UNM and Tucson, the University of Arizona, and UCLA, there are a number of strong programs. But at the time, there were only two. And then in the 1970s, there were also workshops. So another thing that happened in 1975 was there was a workshop named the Center of the Eye Photography Collaborative. And it was a private workshop founded by a woman named Sherry Heiser, who recently died. And they started in, I believe, in Sun Valley or Aspen. And Aspen moved to Sun Valley, and they landed in Santa Fe in 1975.
Mm-hmm.
So before that, between 72 and 75, my interest was primarily in older photographers and historic photography, people like Ansel Adams, William Henry Jackson,
Curtis.
Edward Weston, Curtis. And so when they came to Santa Fe, I joined the center and became a director, and I took photography classes. And
why did you do that?
I love photography. At that time, it was my life. It became my passion pretty quickly. Once I started doing it on a daily basis, it was something I loved to do, looking at the objects, feeling them.
Do you still do photography?
I never did photography, and I discovered early on. So when I took a darkroom class with the center, I'd get in there and I'd put my film on the spool, and my fingers would get stuck and the film would stick together. And, and I didn't like the enclosed space of the darkroom, and the smells particularly weren't things that attracted me, but I could sell them. And so we published a portfolio called the New Mexico Portfolio at the time with 20 esteemed New Mexico photographers. And I realized that there were other people who were really great photographers. They couldn't sell their work, and there were a few people like me who could sell work. And that was a growing group of people around the country. At the same time, people like the University of New Mexico were producing great students who would become the leading curators of many of the leading curators of the late 20th century. So it was kind of a hotbed,
really. New Mexico really was. Yeah. Albuquerque and Santa Fe were one of the centers.
Yeah, it was the center. And so you had a lot of artists going through there, but with Van there, you had a lot of people coming from all over the country to visit the program, because it was the photography community is still a small community compared to painting and other media. And people tend to know everybody. And they tend to gather in conferences where everybody knows everybody.
By the way, did you get your law degree? We never really...
Oh, yes, I did get my law degree. So then I went, and so I was dealing privately. I would go around the country, and we would go visit museums and libraries. And at the time, my wife at the time had gotten into UNM Law School. I think this was in 1978. Could have been 78. And I had always thought about going to law school. And so I applied and went to law school for 3 years, and starting in 1979. One of the people I went to law school with, who was in my wife's study group, is a man named Jonathan Rothschild, who's the current mayor of Tucson.
That's funny.
And so we became friends during law school. Because he lived about 6 doors down, and he was in my wife's study group, so there was a lot of interaction going on.
So you're 29 now, and you have a law degree as well.
That's right. But I was running my business the whole time.
You were buying and selling.
Buying and selling the whole time I was in law school, and then I didn't really have the ability to work for other people very well, so I opened my own law practice, just as I had opened my own photo business. And
that was in Santa Fe?
It was in Albuquerque. I was living in Albuquerque. And so I had a street law practice where people would send me the worst cases with the people who couldn't pay very much for difficult, and
unwinnable cases.
Difficult, unwinnable cases where, clients would want to get custody of their kids without ever having paid child support or visiting them, or odometer rollback cases where somebody would buy a car and the odometer would have been rolled back. And so these cases would never pay enough for real lawyers to take.
And how long did you...
So I lasted for a couple of years doing this, still running my other business. I think I had more bad debts in a year and a half in the law business than I'd had in the 10 years I'd been in the photography business. And so I quickly kind of closed my law practice down at some point. And I did like studying law, but practicing law was a fish of It's something I just never.
Did that come
never
in
took to.
handy though in your business, you
It
think?
came in handy. It taught me about business structures and kind of dealing with business in a certain way that I was quite happy to have learned. In some ways, I regret not having studied. The one thing I regret studying in college was economics. I wish I had actually studied economics in college instead of anthropology.
Just because you felt it would be a better fit for what you have to deal with
Well,
as a dealer?
and also when I study anthropology, one of the things about studying anthropology is you kind of get a worldview. It gives you a view of how the world operates at different times, at different levels of different cultures, smaller communities and larger communities and interactions. And economics is much the same way, except that as I've studied anthropology over the years and read into it, it's clear that economics are, at least in my mind, the great determining factor for a lot of what happens in how cultures grow and collapse. And Jared Diamond is one of my favorite authors about the bigger movements. And a lot of it has to do with resources and the economy. But I never studied that. I studied anthropology, then I studied law. And I had a knack for finding great photographs and for understanding by looking at a photograph.
Why do you think you have that knack? What is it that sets you apart from other people?
I think it's intuitive. I can't say except that it's something I had when I started looking at photographs. The people that mentored me a little bit, Paige Pinnell, who was an old friend and photographer in Santa Fe, one of Van Daren Koch and Jerry Yulesman's students. He and Nick Potter and I would sit around in the 1973, 74 for hours looking at books by Minor White and Edward Weston, Harry Callahan, talking about what qualities made a good photograph from the point of view of what the print looked like.
Was that a technical and aesthetic?
It was aesthetic. It wasn't technical.
Yeah, okay.
And some of it had to do with, there were philosophies about that. The two primary philosophies in photography at the time, or there were three, but the two that we were involved with were the zone system. And the zone system is a scientific method that Ansel created to define the different gray and black tones, and to teach people how to photograph and make use of the different tools that are available in photography, describing through the tones. And the other major influence at the time was a man named Minor White. And Minor was a little younger than Adams, and had a Zen philosophy of So Adams had an idea of pre-visualization. You look at the camera, and you think about what the paper's going to look like, and you think about what chemistry you're going to use. You think about how you're going to develop the negative. And you think about the technical aspects. And then on top of that, you add the emotion. In Minor White's case, his point of view was you look at the object and you let it speak to you, in a sense, until you feel like you've captured the spirit of that object. Now, Minor White's prints are just as beautiful as anybody else's in the 20th century, and he was also one of the great printers. And as was Ansel. And Ansel was Ansel and Edward Weston were two of the greatest printers that ever lived in the 20th century in that chemical printing and silver gelatin printing. But Minor was just as good. And so these two philosophies were kind of going back and forth. And so one of the things that I was thinking of as I was driving over here today, one of the things that I learned at the time was I have a very wide palette of things that I like. I like a lot of different photographs by a lot of different photographers. I like different media, different processes going back to the 19th century. So if somebody comes and asks me, what's my favorite picture? I can never answer the question because I have tens of thousands of favorite pictures that I've seen and had and looked at over the years. And so part of the educational process was really looking at material. The thing about looking at Curtis and starting with Edward Curtis is he had, and maybe has, the largest single body of work of most of the photographers. And Adams might be as big, but the fact that he published 2,200 pictures is a very, very large body of work that he himself published. And that's in addition to other photographs that he took that he didn't publish. So I tend to like a variety of things. And so when I got involved with the Center for Creative Photography, I got clued into a lot of contemporary photography. And there were a number of important photographers living in New Mexico. Paul Campanegro was there, though he didn't participate in the portfolio that we published. Laura Gilpin was there, and she didn't participate, but she was kind of a family acquaintance, and I got to be friends with her.
With Laura Gilpin.
With Laura
Did you know
Gilpin.
Ansel as well?
Never met Ansel. I was always too shy. I felt
Yeah,
I just didn't feel good about
Yeah.
and it turned out that he would have loved me. He
Yeah.
would, because he loved everybody who liked photography.
And what was Gilpin like?
And Gilpin was very modest. I would go visit her. We would see her in town a lot. At the grocery store, we would run into her. The family would run into her. We would see her at concerts.
Was she a superstar at that point? Or kind of still under the radar?
She was a superstar, but she lived in Santa Fe. So by example, Ansel and Laura Gilpin are kind of almost the same generation. Gilpin is actually about 10 years older, 8 or 10 years older. And by being in New Mexico and in Santa Fe, and it's still kind of true, if you do your work there, you're dealing in a smaller market, you're dealing in outside of the mainstream media of where you need to get attention if you're going to promote your career. Ansel, and she had a very modest personality, brilliant woman, but she wasn't
Self-promoter.
a self-promoter. Ansel, on the other hand, was the great promoter, and it was his personality. He had a charismatic, outgoing, extrovert personality. He would talk to everybody he met.
He was very good friends with Dixon. And I think that personality of Dixon and him and Ansel fit nicely together. I think they both had a kind of a gregarious sensibility.
And Ansel loved everybody. And he also, another thing about Adams, when we built a collection for Adams for a Texas oil man named David Arrington, that's the greatest private collection ever built of Adams work. And building this collection, we built this in the 2000s. I really dug deep into what Ansel photographed, and the thing that surprised me most that I hadn't realized is that he was a publisher and a writer, and he spent as much or more time writing every day than he actually did making photography.
And a musician.
And he was also a musician, a pianist. And so, but it was his writing that made him famous, and he started writing and publishing articles in 1920 and 21, and he also started publishing photographs. But he was writing, so by the 1930s, he was writing on a variety of topics, primarily the environment in Yosemite, the Sierra Club, for the Sierra Club Bulletin, and he was writing technical
Yeah, he was
articles.
making content.
And he was writing about aesthetics.
Yeah.
And so one of my favorite stories that we had was some people came in the gallery from Cimarron, New Mexico, which is up by what's called the Boys Ranch, the Boy Scout Ranch up there. And Ansel photographed the Boy Scout Ranch, I think in 1960 for Life magazine. So the people who came in the gallery's parents had a gas station in Cimarron. Every couple of years, they would get a postcard from Ansel, asking him how they were doing, kind of keeping him up to date. And so so this was part of Ansel's fame, was that he would spend 6 hours a day on his typewriter typing articles, but he would also type these things like the postcards, letters, telling people about everything from photography to whatever was on his mind.
He was
on
the
that
Kardashian of his day, doing it through writing and postcards.
Yeah, he was the master of the media. And another thing we discovered about Adams is that he mastered the media in a way that nobody else did. He understood what a photograph looked like on a piece of paper when it was published in the magazine. So I remember growing up, and we would look at things like U.S. Camera magazines, where you would have 100 photographs by the most distinguished photographers, but Ansel's photographs always jumped off the pages, where everybody else's seemed to be of the same caliber.
Because he shot it for the magazine.
Well,
he understood what
it's
it
not
looked like.
his shooting for it, but when he made a print for reproduction, he would understand exactly what the lithographic output of the printing press was. And then he would expose a print that dealt to his own strengths and how that print would look in that magazine. And he's the only one that understood that in a real genuine way throughout his entire life. And I'm amazed that other people didn't figure it out. But there is a reason why his prints did jump off the pages of these magazines. Everybody else's looked the same, and Ansel's just had this other quality.
And what's the most an Ansel Adams photograph will sell for these days? A great one.
It's a great one is going to sell for more than $1 million.
Yeah. And so that's going to be like a moonrise?
That'll be either important vintage print of moonrise or something like that, like Tetons, or a very large mural, a 40 by 60 inch mural.
Now, when did you actually open your gallery in Santa Fe?
So the gallery, so we dealt privately, went to law school, finished law school, got divorced, gave up the law, and then opened a gallery. And at the time, I had a little private office in Albuquerque I was working out of as we traveled around the country, and I was doing fairs at the time, trade fairs. In 1984, I opened a gallery in Old Town in Albuquerque. So it was a 600 square foot space.
And that was Andrew Smith?
That was Andrew Smith.
Photography, painting, and books still?
Yeah. Okay. No, I had incorporated. One of the things I did in law school was I started a corporation in 1979. The reason was I was borrowing money. And at the time, I don't know if you remember the Jimmy Carter years, but interest rates were in the 15, 20, 22, 25%.
I remember.
And so usury laws were in existence at the time that prevented banks from lending money to individuals at above a certain percentage, which I think was about 6%. But if you had a corporation, the bank could lend you the money at the going rate, which at the time I think was around 22%. So I incorporated at the time and was continued to sell privately. And then we opened the gallery in Albuquerque, Andrew Smith Gallery, Inc., in 1984.
And how long were you there in Albuquerque?
And we were there in Albuquerque a couple of years. One of our first shows we did was Barbara Van Cleve's work. And Barbara Van Cleve is in my estimation, the greatest ranch woman and cowgirl and kind of ranch photographer of the late 20th, early 21st century. Montana born and bred. Shoots from a horseback, is still and a great charismatic personality, but a really great photographer who understands cowboy life.
And why was it your first big one? Did you just get the photographs?
Well, no, we were working with photographers, younger photographers, and we were working with old and new. It was very appealing work. We also did a show of Jodie Forster at the time, the landscape photographer. There's a Hispano photographer in Albuquerque named Miguel Gander, and we did our first show of his at the time, and Tom Barrow. And so we were working with some of the regional photographers. And Barbara at that time had moved to Santa Fe.
I see.
And people would come in to Old Town and they'd look at the pictures and they'd say, "Maud, these are just pictures. Let's go next door and buy some art." And we'd do openings, and we'd have a couple dozen people come to the openings. And then we did an Annie Leibovitz show. And Annie's a photographer that we've also worked with for 35 years.
And that was in Albuquerque?
That was in Albuquerque. And she had just published her first book, first monograph. And so we had her out to Albuquerque and did the show, which was coming from Sidney Janis Gallery. And it was her first real foray into the art world, something which she never has cared that much about doing.
Right.
But so we did the show in Albuquerque, and 600 people came to the open.
Wow, so they knew who she was.
And they knew who she was, and we suddenly realized that Annie was also different than all the other photographers that we were dealing with, and still remains different. In my opinion, she's one of the greatest photographers we've ever dealt with, and she has a following. I would consider her the most popular photographer in America.
Yeah, even more than Cindy Sherman?
A lot more than Cindy Sherman. I mean, you have people like Lee Friedlander or who are renowned photographers. But Annie's the most popular.
Did you ever want to get your photo taken by Annie? Or did you?
Not particularly. No, I never asked her. I knew it was going to be more expensive than I wanted to pay. Even at the time, she was expensive.
Yeah.
So we would do shows in Albuquerque. And then we had a client in Albuquerque who wanted to buy a kind of, at the time, expensive photograph we had. But they only wanted to buy it from somebody in Santa Fe. Because Santa Fe had cachet.
Yeah.
Albuquerque had no cachet.
Right.
So we wholesaled it to our friends Scheinbaum and Russick in Santa Fe, and they sold it to the Albuquerque client. And in the middle of this transaction, I said, well, I'm not sure why I'm in Albuquerque anymore. Let's move to Santa Fe. So we moved to Santa Fe and opened the gallery there in 1986.
86. Yeah, and it was really happening in 86.
Yeah, and so at the time then we were upstairs on the plaza. We were above Ray Dewey's gallery. We were next door to Nat Owing, and Nat had just started his gallery after teaching up in Montana, where he'd been a college professor.
Yeah.
And it was an immediate success. People at the time were coming to Santa Fe. Santa Fe was, at the time, it could have been one of the 3 or 4 major art centers in the country, as it was alleged to have been for many, many years
Right.
after. But at the time, it probably was. Elaine Horwich was there, and in my mind, Elaine Horwich was the greatest dealer that came to Santa Fe. And Peter...
Even more than me?
There were people in the 80s. This is in the 80s.
Okay, I wasn't there.
You had Gerald Peters and you had Forrest Fenn, who probably had bigger businesses, but maybe not, and were dealing with a lot of great art. But Elaine was in her own way the greatest promoter. She had social skills that were unmatched, being both New York social skills and kind of out west social skills. And she could deal with a variety of art. She kind of invented Southwest style, the Howling Coyote and those kinds of things that she would show next to people like Havard, and very smart contemporary art. And she was in Scottsdale, she was in Prescott, she was in Palm Springs, and she was in Santa Fe.
Yep.
But Santa Fe and Scottsdale were her main 2 places. And Sedona, I think she also, not Prescott, but Sedona.
Yeah, Sedona for a very short period.
And so I think she helped create a lot of excitement at the time, along with Forrest Fenn also had a knack for publicity at the time. And being an Air Force pilot, he also had kind of a great personality to deal with people who were kind of wealthy and
he's not intimidated.
And collectors. He's not intimidated, and people who collect like people who are smart. But he was a decorated Air Force pilot, and there's a certain cachet that goes in dealing with someone like that who's an interesting and smart art dealer. And so Santa Fe got to be a very interesting town. In the 80s and 90s, it was people would, and there was also a growth of collecting amongst a huge, wide swath of people. There was a cachet in the air that collecting and was something that you could do, that art and painting and photography, sculpture, that these were all interesting things that we valued as a culture. The physical objects, and that a lot of people, not just museums, but regular people with money, doctors, lawyers, businessmen, were collecting vast quantities. And in the 1990s, prices were going up regularly, weekly, monthly. We would get calls many times a day of people buying things. I think the number of invoices, when we look back historically, we can look at the invoices that we wrote back then, and we probably would write more in a month than we do in a year now.
Wow.
Just because of the popularity of the media. And this was true throughout the country. I think it was true in New York and Phoenix and Scottsdale.
Did you ever consider expanding at your heyday, like, I should be in New York, I should be in LA?
Well, we did expand a couple times, but it never worked out. We had a gallery in Telluride for a month, but we got in a fight between the man who owned the building and Sandra Carradine, who was our landlord. And so that lasted a month. But we also discovered there that we were 20 feet off the main
Yeah,
dragging
problem.
people wouldn't walk.
Yeah.
We had a gallery in Aspen briefly in the early '90s, and if I had moved there, I think we could have succeeded there very, very well. But I was based in Santa Fe, and it needed somebody there. But one of my favorite stories when I was in Aspen at the time was the first time I ran into Donald Trump, not in person, but by reputation.
Yes.
So I had a friend up there, Tom Tavelli, who had a gallery called the Tavelli Gallery, a very high-powered contemporary art gallery. And I would go, and he was also an old friend. He and I had grown up together in Santa Fe. And so I would go visit him during this time, while we were setting up the gallery, and for a couple of years before that. And we were walking around one day about, what to do that night, what's going on, where should we go out? And he said, well, why don't you go to the Caribou Club? Well, what's that? Well, the Caribou Club was a very exclusive club that still is in existence, founded by a man named Harley Baldwin.
Right.
And at the time, my recollection is that it cost about $50,000 a person to buy a membership in it. So, the story on the streets was that Baldwin had figured out that if he gave Donald Trump a complimentary membership, that Trump would bring him plenty of people who would pay the $50,000. And so I didn't think much about it at the time, but in late 2016, it just came into my mind that people had been trading on Trump's name for a long, long time.
Yeah. I wonder if he brought any people in.
He did. I'm sure he did.
Yeah,
because it was I'm sure he brought in
Harley
a bunch
Brown,
of people.
He was a smart guy. He knew. Yeah, he probably understood that concept.
Yeah. So, and I think it was a very successful thing for Harley to have done. That was one of the places we expanded. We also did some small partnerships with galleries. In the late 1980s, we had most of the estate of the great photojournalist W. Eugene Smith. He had died in 1977 or 78 here in Tucson. His collection his archive is at the Center for Creative Photography. And so he had 5 children, 2 sons and 3 daughters, and we had worked with the 3 daughters and got their estate. We sold most of the prints to one of our Japanese collectors, but at the same time...
And is the international market still big?
The international market is still very big. And at the same time, then we formed a partnership for a year with a gallery in Osaka. And so we did expansion, but we didn't expand so much as we mentored other people in the business who set up galleries themselves. And that I'm very proud of that. Always happy that we were able to do that and work with other people.
And that allows you to get material and to sell material and develop those relationships, right?
It does.
Yeah.
It does. And Edward Curtis was often the person that would lead the way. Curtis was very popular. The ideas of the revisionist history on Curtis occurred in the 1980s when people realized that everybody assumed that all the pictures there's the idea that there's truth in photography, that what you're looking at is what you're actually seeing in a sense of what the picture looked like when it was made. And so one of my favorite examples, Beaumont Newhall, the great historian of photography, in his magnum opus on the history of photography, talks about truth in photography and used as his primary example a photograph from the Civil War by Timothy O'Sullivan, calling the sharpshooter's last redoubt.
Yeah, I've seen that image.
And he said, this is a true picture with all the tension that you would take if you found it this way. Well, it turned out that O'Sullivan moved the body 100 feet and kind of arranged it artistically. But Beaumont didn't know this. This came out after, in the 1970s, maybe the 1980s. So there's the idea of truth in photography, and people would look at the photographs of the Native Americans and feel that there was a certain truth, the truth about what was expressed there. And in Curtis's case, what Curtis did, and this is where it did kind of coincide with what I studied, was he did ethnohistory. Or ethnophoto history, we might even call it today. So his intention was to present a view of the North American Indian as they lived before the white man came. So to go to that extent then, for the most part, when he would do portraits, he would cover up any clothing that was made before this hypothetical time before the white man came. Mm-hmm. It also created for a great dramatic portrait with the lighting that he used. And Curtis was, and all of the people that we deal with, were very skilled photographers. And one of the things to understand about photography is when it was invented in 1839 by Daguerre and the positive to negative to positive process by William Henry Fox Talbot, that once they figured out how to fix the image, that the quality of the photograph was there, and it has improved, but the quality of prints made in the 1840s is just as strong as the quality of prints we find made today. And the skill of the photographers, the skill in chemistry, in dodging and in editing and cropping and taking things out of pictures that maybe they didn't want to see, has always been part of the history of photography. So people assumed, looking at Curtis, that everything was true when he was presenting this different kind of story. If you read his text, and his text was substantial, it was typical ethnographic text of the time, where he would describe certain events, he would describe the rituals and lifestyles of the Indians, and kind of typical, kind of what I consider kind of boring academic prose. It's descriptive, purely descriptive ethnography. And so people would look at Curtis, and so then it was discovered in the 1980s that maybe Curtis used the, and it was also typical of photographers, and this goes back to the 19th century, to have costumes around their studios that the subjects would dress in.
Yeah.
And Alexander Gardner had this in the 1870s. Curtis would do this. And there's, at one point, somebody sent us a dissertation where somebody had looked at all the 2,200 published photographs of Curtis to find out when he would repeat certain clothes. And there was one war shirt that he used in 84 different pictures that he used primarily with the Nez Perce.
Yeah.
So suddenly people realized that maybe it wasn't quite as true. And then the idea of the vanishing race trope, and we talked about this earlier, the trope that what we're doing is preserving this vanishing race, when now it's clear that the race not only didn't vanish, but they're still here, I think is the name of the newest David Truer history.
Right, and thriving.
And thriving. We're still here. We never disappeared.
Yeah.
But the trope itself became the focus of a lot of photography, and it also
and paintings too.
And paintings, and it also was a common theme that people thought about. Even though, for me, growing up in Santa Fe, I know, there was no vanishing race in Santa Fe. The Pueblo Indians and the Indians were everywhere, and they weren't declining in population as far as I could tell, and they weren't kind of these quaint ethnographic artifacts and exhibitions.
You ultimately left Santa Fe and have moved to Tucson.
So that's very recent.
Yeah.
So we stayed in Santa Fe. I grew up in Santa Fe, and I moved back there in '86. We actually opened the gallery in '85 in Santa Fe, and then I moved back in '86. And then recently in last fall, about a year ago, a little year and a half ago, my wife and I decided that we wanted to get in a hotter climate. I've never liked cold weather. She's never liked cold weather.
And why Tucson?
And we came to Tucson for a lot of reasons. One is I like living in a beautiful landscape. Yeah. And when I started looking around at the houses and the landscape around Tucson, I realized it was just as beautiful as any place I'd ever lived in New Mexico and Colorado.
Yeah, I would agree.
The second is I wanted a place where they were smart about photography. And Tucson has a Center for Creative Photography, which is one of the greatest archives of photographers' work in the country. And it attracts critics and photographers the way that UNM might have done in the 1970s. It's serves as a center of photography around the country, and that was attractive. Terry Etherton was here, and and Mark Sublette were here, and there are a number of my great colleagues were here and said it's great, and it's just a very nice, mellow town, and we wanted something that was more affordable.
And you've opened a gallery too,
and
right?
We've opened a gallery in downtown Tucson on 6th Avenue and 6th Street.
It's beautiful.
We're very happy.
It's very nice.
We're very
Great
happy.
walls.
Yeah. So
you know how long we talked? No idea, right? Getting close.
2 hours?
Yeah. So this is the guy who didn't want to come and talk because he didn't have anything to say.
So we'll come back and do this another time and look at photographs and talk about photographs.
Yeah, I think it would be fantastic.
I think that's what I like to do, is talk about photographs.
Yeah, I think that would be a wonderful podcast, and that maybe actually show different photos, and you can go through some of the things that excite you as not only as a dealer, but also as just somebody who has an eye, a great eye, built on the basis of radiology.
That's right, exactly.
That's actually, the funniest thing. People have asked me many times, well, how did you get into the business of art? And I said, well, I was always good at reading x-rays. I loved x-rays because I was really good at it. I looked for the small details, and I walked away and looked for the big details, and I found it to be compelling and quite easy. And I thought, wow, that helped me become a better art dealer, actually. So we have this in common.
That's great. Fabulous.
Thank you, Andrew Smith.
Well, thank you, Mark.
If you're in Tucson, come see his gallery. He has a fantastic gallery, and he's, as you now know, is quite expert in his field. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
All right. Very good.
Gallery, located for over 26 years in Tucson, Arizona, specializing in antique Native American art, early Western art, including the famed Maynard Dixon, as well as modern art. You can find everything online at medicinemangallery.com. There's over 6,000 objects to select from. Also, the Charles Bloom Murder Mystery Series, written by yours truly, me, Mark Sublette. There's 6 books in this series, and they follow the protagonist Charles Bloom through all the intrigue of the art world set in Santa Fe and the Navajo Nation. These can be found on Audible, ebooks, Amazon, and of course, the gallery at medicinemangallery.com.